Good morning. Welcome to this morning's webinar on transport decarbonisation. My name is Sally McNamara and I'm a director in the Social and Market Research team. So climate change is a global problem. The UK has a plan to achieve net zero by 2050. But in the Climate Change Committee's latest progress report to Parliament, they flagged their concerns that we're not on track to meet targets. They've highlighted a lack of urgency. They've highlighted the need to stay firm on commitments and move to delivery. And they've highlighted the need for immediate priority actions and policies. I think they could do with a bit of advice from our expert panel. So we've got four fantastic speakers this morning. Firstly, apologies that Lara Salinas was unable to make the session, but we do have four really good speakers. They're going to be giving us their views on some of the policy areas that could achieve the greatest level of impact. I'm sure you'll have questions as we go along, so please do use the Q&A box. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion at the end of that. So I'm delighted to welcome David Connolly from SYSTRA.
Thank you, Sally. So yes, I'm David Connolly. I am Director of Low Carbon Mobility at SYSTRA, and I have been developing low emission strategies and emission reduction strategies for most of my working career with the MVA SYSTRA. And I am going to be putting forward the case for a need for improved and more enthusiastic demand management. And I have a few slides to back that up. So here we go. So, as Sally suggested, there are a number of challenges that we need to address as a country and as a world. The first is the need to reduce fossil fuel use as quickly as possible. The second in the UK is the need to maintain the road network, because we aren't going to all live in our own little dwellings. We will need to still continue to move about, so there is a need to maintain road and public transport networks. This relevant schemes will need to be self-funding because there isn't a surplus of cash around in the UK, so anything that we come up with in terms of demand management and other measures will need to be as close to self-funding as possible. The measures that we introduce will need to be equitable, or it should be equitable at the very least, and more importantly, in terms of speedy implementation, they will have to be acceptable to decision makers, which is not quite the same as being acceptable to the general public, but it's closely related. So if we're going to do it quickly, we have to agree that it is a fair and equitable and deliverable approach that we are recommending. So let's see what those challenges mean for us. Some of the sort of issues that lie behind those challenges is a potential loss of revenue to the UK government from fuel duty. But that probably shouldn't be the main driver, but it is something to keep an eye on, and that is equivalent to about 4% of the UK's tax take. And if you lost all fuel duty because everything went to battery electric, you would need something like 5p extra on the basic rate of income tax, which probably wouldn't be very popular. So that's the scale of the revenue that we're talking about as if and when we move to non-fossil fuel vehicles. There's also a big price differential for new BEVs, which is delaying their uptake, and a supply issue with still, although that has been overcome. But generally, new BEVs are very expensive and only affordable by wealthier households and other leasing companies and the like. So how do we overcome the fact that anything that isn't a fossil fuel vehicle is going to, for new vehicles, are going to be more expensive and overcome that price differential? There is the nuisance factor of public charging, particularly if you don't have the access to home charging for your BEV, which is again a disincentive to getting to something that isn't a fossil fuel vehicle. There's a big demand for new cars that comes through leasing and car hire, who aren't quite often they don't like electric vehicles because of the sort of car hire aspect, in terms of people trying to make long journeys for their holidays or whatever, not finding BEVs very convenient. So what do we do about that? Because once those cars are in the fleet, we have a problem basically, because they stay in the fleet for a long time. The biggest problem, and we'll probably come back to it, but is the need with the sort of democracy, the need for decision makers to remain popular at all times, and in particular coming up to elections, which is, if you like, definitely an issue in terms of making hard decisions. And then the whole of the need to restrict fossil fuel use has been not hampered, but there is a cost of living crisis. People are really struggling to get through their day. They don't want to hear about the things that are going to make that day even more expensive at the minute. So that cost of living is a real challenge and a real drag on our ability to be nimble from an emissions point of view. Next slide, please. So the good news is that we can change our car use, and in particular, the use of diesel vehicles has dropped dramatically from over 50%, and at a time, and the forecast suggested that it was going to continue at that, to less than, I think it's about 12% at the minute in terms of pure diesel. So it is possible, and that's just over 7 or 8 years. So it is possible to change what the vehicle buying choices of the traveling public. And in fact, the growth in BEVs was growing fast enough to reach a 100% target by 2030, while that target was still a thing. It has slowed down in the last year, and we could debate why that has slowed down. So it has remained effectively at that 17% in 2023 SMT figures, so whereas it was previously rising, but it was growing and is growing fast enough to get to where we need to be from a technology point of view. So that's good. We're not stuck in the world of fossil fuel, but on the converse, there's some bad news. Next slide, please. So the bad news is that the vehicle
Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. It appears David has just dropped off. Just bear with us 2 seconds and hopefully we'll have him back.
Okay, apologies for that. I think we will try and get David back. I'd love to hear more about this. In the meantime, shall we move to our next speaker, who is Jorgen, who's going to talk to us about accelerating low carbon motive power.
Thank you, Sally. Hello all, I'm Jorgen Peterson. I'm a transport technology specialist supporting SYSTRA. Over the last few months, 6 or 7 months, I've been developing a number of articles which have all been published in Transport Extra relating to future fuels, and I've been asked to give a few minutes overview of where we currently stand with future fuels, which I have a few slides to work through. If we can have the next slide, please. The first thing I'd say is, as per what David and Sally have also said, I would question everything. Are our 2032, 2037 and 2050 goals achievable? And I think we should actually ask that question in a slightly more generic way. If we look at the current carbon savings that we've achieved thus far, I would say they're really not. And I think we need to be much more aware of that and much more aware of what we need to do to better plan for our future. If we can move on. One of the things that we have to say, and this sort of leads on to some of the bad news I think David was going to tell us. If you start looking at the government figures back from 2022, these are the freight emissions. There's been no change since 1990. Light van emissions have increased by 62%, and still our level of private hire is significant. If you look at 2023 figures, congestion is almost at the same as what it was in pre-pandemic levels. So whilst we're moving in the right direction, we're not moving fast enough, is what I really want to say. But if you see on the next slide, it's not all bad news. UK is actually doing tremendously well in renewables. In 2022, up until 2022, let's say, they were actually leading the world in terms of offshore wind farms. That only got surpassed last year by China, who astoundingly essentially leapfrogged everybody else. But by the same token, what we're doing from a wind farm and from a renewables point of view is significant. Around 41% of renewable energy comes at the moment from renewables. Energy comes from renewables, sorry, that was badly spoken. But by the same token, depending on which stats you look at, that can change anything from 41 to around 52%. And it also depends, obviously, on the amount of wind that's available, sun that's available, etc. In addition to that, the UK has actually developed a company called HVS, Hydrogen Vehicle Systems, I think they're called, has developed a 40-ton zero-emission hydrogen lorry, which I think went into production last year. It may be this year. If you go to Move this year, they'll probably be there. They were last year. It's really worth watching and seeing what they can actually achieve. In addition, you've got electric road systems starting in trials starting in Scunthorpe, being delivered by both Costain and Siemens. And there are a number of different hydrogen projects going on around the country at the moment, around 70 at the moment going on, which are really trying to investigate whether hydrogen is a potential fuel source. And if you look abroad, Finland's gone all in with hydrogen pretty much. America is catching up. They're actually producing some fairly large hydrogen production facilities at the moment. If we can have the next slide, please. So from a motive power, what are the options? Well, obviously there's EV. We can't deny that. And actually, I think they will always remain part of the rich landscape of fuels available for transport. There's electric road systems. And I think I want to plant a vision and an idea in your heads at this point where if we actually use electric road systems for hub-to-hub type transport or port-to-hub type transport, and actually think about that more generically, and particularly how that could then be used with other technologies as well, I think we've got a real opportunity there. But then there's also the synthetic fuels, and I really should say bio and synthetic fuels here as well. As we move on, I'd like to also suggest that there are also hybrid electric vehicles and hydrogen, all of which we could actually start to see better use of. If we can have the next slide, please. So from an EV point of view, I'm not the strongest advocate of EV, as people will tell you, but by the same token, I think they are part of our rich tapestry of future technologies and future fuels. I think the main issues I have with them, as David started to allude to, is they are generally more expensive, and therefore the more affluent can afford them and perhaps not the less affluent. I think they're heavier and therefore cause more particulates, which are now deemed to be, by some at least, as bad as CO2 and NOx. I don't think we fully understand what the carbon footprint of them is, particularly when it comes to decommissioning batteries as we move forward. And as David said just before we lost him, I think there's also this issue with how do we actually get enough charges to the right people at the right time, particularly with those people that don't have larger houses or the ability to have an in-house charger. Next slide, please. So synthetic fuels. Now, this is one of the areas which is quite controversial. Synthetic fuels and biofuels and carbon capture fuels are not going to give us complete carbon neutrality necessarily. They will still produce carbon, they'll still produce NOx, but by the same token, it's vastly reduced. And from a carbon neutrality point of view, they are generally seen to be carbon neutral. If you start looking at hydrogen, there are two different options there as well. There is obviously the fuel cell technology, but there is also the ability to have hydrogen ICEs, both of which are already in production, both of which are already available. The problem is we don't actually have the distribution network for them. If you start looking at that distribution network, what we've done over the last decades is produce this purpose-built distribution network, which really does work based on the average range of a vehicle. And those that weren't in the right place have already fallen by the wayside and are no longer viable. But I think we need to start thinking about that distribution network for other fuels as well, whether that's synthetic, bio, carbon capture, or hydrogen. Those are purpose-built and could actually be implemented quite easily. Next, please. So, but before we get to that, I think some of the things that Sally said and some of the things that David was also alluding to, there are a significant number of things we need to be doing differently. We have to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. Just 10% of reduction of transport will actually see going from stop-start to essentially free flow. And there's a number of different ways we can do that. As David alluded to, there are issues with the budgets and how we'd actually manage those budgets, particularly with the reduction of the fuel duty. But we could also get around that with road user charging or with carbon fees even. And I actually think the carbon fees is probably a better way, or even a combination of the two is a better way of doing it. We could provide incentives for offset journeys. We could reduce the overall spend on highway infrastructure projects and actually use that same money to actually implement some of these other options we're talking about. But if we're going to do that, we must also look at other alternative methods of travel. We must also look at, is our lifestyle and work style right? Do we need to change that? I think the pandemic taught us that it was possible to change. Unfortunately, it's also taught us since the pandemic that we revert back to old ways. So perhaps we need to readdress that as well. Next, please. So my proposal would be, and I think the first element here is probably the most important, we must embrace new technologies. I would love, and I think we need to become the trial test bed for new technologies, obviously assuming those and making sure that those are right for us. But if we become the trial test bed, what we get to is the ability to really analyze that data and see where or when they would work and where they perhaps wouldn't. I think the other thing we've got to say is carbon neutrality will not be completed in a single step with a single technology. It's going to take a rich tapestry of those, and it's going to be completed over a number of different years as per the goals we've set, but not necessarily in the same way they have been set. I would love to think that we need to really start looking at the long-term carbon position of EVs, particularly in terms of decommissioning and particularly in terms of what it's going to cost for us from a carbon point of view to increase the national grid to accommodate everything that all the vehicles, assuming everybody had an EV. I also think, though, that we've got this brilliant Aussie energy production capability, and at night they're twiddling around doing absolutely nothing, essentially not creating the amount of energy they need to create. All of that could be pushed into green hydrogen very easily. Likewise, I think we should actually reassess other technologies such as carbon capture, which we must have known through Formula One. They're transitioning to carbon capture to fuels next year. I think it's next year anyway. But also synthetic and bio. And if you start looking at the algae and actually the seagrass elements of that, they're also seen as being actually better than carbon neutral at this point in time. But if we are going to embrace new technologies, I think we start looking at ERS systems, electric road systems, coupled with potentially platooning and then thereafter autonomous mobility, particularly in those environments where you've got hub-to-hub type operations. That would be very easy to achieve. That you could then offset all freight going at night during those hours where the road really isn't used very well, and actually start to improve our road usage and to offset the number of freight vehicles actually during the day. I also think that autonomous mobility in a rural transport should be looked at in more detail to enhance our rural transport networks. If we were to do that, and at the moment, I don't think the technology is there yet, but the technology will never be there until we start looking at running trials and understanding what the data is telling us and understanding how they need to change and evolve to actually meet those requirements. And the other thing which I think we have to do is again, coming back to David's presentation, to offset that fuel duty tax, we have to look at road user charging and carbon fees. And that needs to be done in the short term, not the long term. So if we can go on to the last slide, please. So I think it's brilliant that we've got grandiose plans. I think it's fantastic that we're in a position that we've got this goal we've set. The problem is, I don't think goals are achievable unless they are planned, unless you have clear direction, unless you have clear investment to support those plans. And at this point in time, I don't think we've got any of those things. And I think that's where we need to concentrate. If we concentrate on those, the rest will become much simpler than what it has before. I also think that this will lead on to, I'm sure, some questions. Some of these options that we're presenting to you will be seen as deeply unpopular. They're essentially the same as going from the horse and cart to the car, or going from the paddle steamer to the propeller-driven steamer. They are very different approaches, and it's going to actually affect our lifestyles. It's going to affect how we perceive the world around us to a certain extent. But I do think if we start doing some of these things, that these carbon neutral goals that we have set ourselves are achievable. Not necessarily in the way that they were initially proposed, though. So, in the words of Albert Einstein, I'm going to leave you with some words which are far wiser than I'll ever come up with. I think that sometimes the easiest way to solve a problem is to stop participating in the problem. And on that note, I'll pass you back to Sally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jürgen. That was really interesting. So I guess my takeouts from that is you've talked to us about EVs. You've raised questions about decommissioning them. You've talked to us about some new technology options and investing into them. It was interesting that you brought out the behavior side of it. So it's not just a case of introducing new technologies, but the driving behavior needs to change, and you link that with automated technologies. But also some immediate actions about the short term and charging. And I love that you said that the plans are achievable, if not the way that we're doing them at the moment. So thank you, that was really interesting. Right, so I'm so pleased to welcome back David. So we'll pick up where we left off. Thank you.
Sorry, folks. Yes, I'm major laptop issue there, but I'm back in the room now. So yes, I was highlighting the main problem with relying on technology, which is the lag that it takes a long time for those vehicles that are being bought now to drop out of the fleet, and in particular the fact that means that there's a large proportion of the vehicles that are being the ICE vehicles that are being bought now are still going to be emitting for years to come, and we don't get the drop by 2030 that all of the trajectories require, whether that's a 17% drop as per the 6th Climate Change Committee central scenario, or more ambitious drops in emissions in 2030. Later years solve themselves if the technology keeps being rolled out, but it's the short term, that 2030 is the real challenge and needs the demand management measures. Next slide, please. So it is my contention, and I will state now that this is my views rather than the views of SYSTRA or anybody else that pays my wages, but it's my view that the price of car use will have to rise if we're going to achieve the drop. So you either decide you don't need to achieve the trajectory, or if you decide you do want to get to the target of net zero and the trajectory that's required, the price of car use will have to rise to disincentivize the use of unnecessary car use and generally encourage the use of the other modes where they are available, and car sharing or fewer trips where alternatives are not available. A lot of politicians like the carrot, so the better active travel, the cheaper public transport and the better public transport, and those are all good and all necessary, but they won't achieve the reduction that's needed if we believe that, or if we achieve the trajectory required. So you can't do it with just carrots. You do need to do something with the mode that's causing the emissions and target those emissions directly rather than just improving the alternatives. Next slide, please. So there are a number of ways of increasing the cost of car use, some more politically acceptable and equitable than others. So parking charges, we're all familiar with the concept that there aren't enough parking spaces for everyone, and therefore we will ration the use of those using charges. In my view, that almost every car parking should be charged for, to just encourage you not to use that, and it's particularly effective for short trips because obviously that charge is a bigger proportion of the overall cost and convenience. And in fact, there are a lot of towns and cities where the town centre car parking charge for commuters is what's stopping everyone driving into their place of work and getting free parking. So within that, I would include workplace levies as a must policy, if you like, just to make it obvious that free parking is not a sustainable policy anywhere. You have to watch. You don't just do that in city centres. So you have to roll it out to your office, to your out of town centres as well, and make it just the thing that you pay for parking, and that targets typically the short journeys in urban areas. You could increase the cost of car ownership. That's it's going to be unpopular, and B, it's actually inequitable, because those who can afford a car continue to afford it, and those who can't get priced out and suffer the benefits of losing access to car mobility. So the car ownership is unlikely to be the answer directly, but it might be part, but it's not something I would advocate. And if you could target the second car cost, it would be slightly more progressive and equitable. But it's very hard to see how to do that. So I would say that's not going to be a good way of demand management, is to doing very much about the cost of car ownership, just instead tackle the car use of those cars, in particular fossil fuel. The quickest and easiest to do is just to put a carbon tax on petrol and diesel. It's not going to be popular in cost of living crisis and people who can't afford to feed themselves, but are for whatever reason requiring to use fossil fuel vehicles. But you can find ways of reimbursing those or subsidising those people with no choice and inability to pay the higher cost. But it is, in my view, there should be a carbon tax and a message that the price of fossil fuel will increase over time, and that all the politicians should just agree that that is the obvious thing to do. So if you're trying to reduce fossil fuel use, let's add a tax to encourage that and push people towards using it less, using it more efficiently for journeys for which that's the only alternative, and encourage the uptake of zero emission. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit distance-based road user charging. So this is if you actually could charge for the actual cost of a journey and perceive that cost for every journey. You could help achieve the mode shift directly because of the perception of that cost. It would encourage the use of the other modes. It would directly target the high mileage, so the polluter pays policy, and that's therefore fairer than just car tax, which just has everybody paying the same for their vehicle. Would help to plug the revenue gap and could be used to incentivize EV uptake. So the charges per kilometre could vary because it would effectively be feeding into a carbon tax component as well as just a road use tax. And it would also avoid the unfairness of EV owners currently getting able to use the road network for free because they're not paying fuel duty. So it would be more equitable and revenue raising and could deliver a number of objectives. And you could ultimately adjust the tariff to reflect where there were alternatives and where there weren't. So you only pay where there is for journeys where there is a better alternative or more sustainable alternative. And it's better than just slapping tolls on particular bridges and roads and whatever, which have a bad habit. And clean air zones come into this a little bit, a bad habit of creating rerouting unless designed well, whereas a blanket distance-based charge across the UK would avoid that inefficiency of rerouting. The snag is that the telemetry needed to do it right on a distance-based journey by journey basis, or street by street, road by road basis is not. It's almost there, but not quite, and therefore the general nuisance of introducing means it can't be done quick enough. But you could be flagging that's where we're going because that's where we have to go. Simpler, on the next slide, please. Simpler, it would be just to make your vehicle excise duty based on your distance travelled per year. You could monitor that, and you could have schemes that even if you didn't monitor directly, you couldn't sell your vehicle unless it matched your kilometres driven. It would give you a bit of a message that you need to reduce your miles, and again, the charge could continue to target low emission rather than fossil fuel, and big cars tax more than little cars for their distance, based on the implication of how many litres of fuel you've burnt in the year by travelling your 9,000, 10,000, 50,000, whatever number of miles you've driven in the year, and pay your tax at the end of the year. The snag with that is the incentive is lost because it's just a price at the end, and it doesn't affect your day-to-day choice that much, and you would have to be doing your hearts and minds comms campaigns to get that message over that the distance is the problem, not the tax itself. And and it still would require some time to implement. So it could follow the message about fuel price basically, rather than being an immediate thing. But it is quicker than the telemetry-based, distance-based charge, and would be fairly simple and get the message over that driving fossil fuel vehicles for a large number of miles is going to be expensive. Next slide, please. Just this is when you get the presentation, there's a number of reports, but basically if you read nothing else other than the Committee on Climate Change, you would feed back to the UK government and Scotland. You would see where the problem is and what their solutions are, and generally very well thought out solutions there too. Thank you very much, and sorry about the technology problems.
Thank you, David. That was really clear and great to see the pros and cons in such a clear way. So I think my take out from that is this has been looking at the price of car use and the fact that it will need to increase. And we've also had our UC mentioned again as well, road charging. Okay, so I'd like to welcome Tristan now.
Hello, thank you very much, Sally. Good morning, everybody. So I'm a researcher at University College London in the Energy Institute, as it says on this slide. I don't have any slides, and so I'll be talking off the top of my head, but with my notes. Just to give some background, my daily focus tends to be on ocean-going sea transport, and obviously that's primarily freight. But I did lead in the recent past a project called Decarbonising UK Freight. So we have worked very closely with the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, which is Heriot-Watt, Cambridge, Westminster, and some other groups, and tried to produce more integrated perspectives about how particularly rail, road freight, and shipping might decarbonise. The road freight puzzle that we particularly joined up in that multimodal perspective has been more the heavy goods vehicle. So I'm not going to talk so much about last mile logistics, which I recognise have lots of innovation going on already, talking about the kind of heavy goods vehicle, maybe some of the mid-size trucks that we see, but then domestic and coastal ships, offshore vessels, and the rail network that moves freight around. And so having given that kind of précis, you'll hopefully appreciate that some of this is going to be quite different to what you've heard otherwise, but hopefully I can make some connections and we can have a good discussion in due course. So just looking at the technology pathways for each of these in a very high level, superficial way. Ships, ocean-going ships will need to decarbonise off fossil fuel using a liquid fuel. Battery electrification isn't viable for the ranges that they have to cover. The least cost solution that we've analysed, and many others as well, is using ammonia, which is actually essentially a hydrogen carrier. So you generate green hydrogen and then you combine it with nitrogen into an ammonia molecule, NH3, which is the cheapest way to store that hydrogen, but also to use it on board a ship. Much lower cost than if you use liquid hydrogen, which is the only alternative from a pure hydrogen perspective. You can make, you can use biofuels, you can use carbon capture and storage on land to produce blue fuels, you can use, you can make synthetic hydrocarbons. None of those are going to be affordable in the midterm, biofuels, because there are many other sectors which have much higher willingness to pay than shipping, because shipping's willingness to pay is limited by the cost of ammonia, which is relatively cheap compared to some of the other ways of generating energy. And then the synthetic fuels are more complex molecules. You need a source of carbon. That carbon, ironically, is going to be constrained in the future, or at least sustainable low carbon carbon, if you like, not just captured from a fossil production point. So that means that those fuels are not long-term solutions, and they're essentially dead ends. So that's the technology pathway for ships. If we look at trucks, it was nice to hear about the electric road system. So the Cambridge, sorry, not Cambridge, the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight has done a lot of work to try and build a picture of what electric road systems could look like for the UK, and estimated that they are, if sort of appropriately managed and organised, likely to be a least cost pathway. The other being a battery electric vehicle dominated system in the future, with heavy goods vehicles having rapid charging infrastructure at the strategic points around the UK. So those two options consistently look more attractive at least for the UK's network, than a hydrogen trucking future. Much of that is to do with the very poor round trip efficiency that you have whenever you put hydrogen in any role. So we talk about its use in shipping because there is no electrification alternative, but for trucks, which have got the potential to be either connected to an overhead system or charging on a regular basis, the round trip efficiency that you get is 3 or 4 times greater than the use of the electrons from a renewable source to make hydrogen and consumed on board, and that makes it very hard to sort of make the economics work in the longer run, especially when you look at cost curves of some of the key component technologies. So trucking electrification, rail electrification as well. So we have about 800 miles of rail network that, if electrified over the coming decade or so, would mean that 95% of rail freight would then be electrified, and that would be a long step forwards, a significant step forwards, and the electrification is by far the most obvious solution for that particular mode of transport, for obvious reasons, hopefully. So we basically have a significant scenario of major electrification for these modes, and I think the connection to some of the other conversations that we've been having is, how does that then get integrated into a whole UK picture, such that the public transport, the private vehicle transport, and the investments that need to be made can be leveraged by all of those different modes in the most efficient way. And that's not trivial, because there are obviously slightly different demands, even if one of the common ones is a liberalization of the grid and an enabling of some of the last mile connections of grid electricity into the various points in the infrastructures and networks that need to be made very quickly and very cost effectively. So we need to find a way. When I say liberalize, I mean partly from a planning perspective, because it can take years, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to get some of that connection in place, but also from a cost perspective, we need to have a system where all of the different stakeholders who've got one of these components of the technology change puzzle to shift from fossil into electricity have got a cheap way to make sure that evolves and as efficiently as possible. One of the points that we've developed in our research is the critical role of ports and port cities. So ports become quite obvious key nodes. They're often where offshore renewable electricity comes ashore, or they're close to that. And they're where you get the interactions between the vessels and the road freight network and the rail freight network, and obviously then the local city with its own private and public transport needs as well. So there's a significant potential for the evolution of this system to leverage off those ports as some of the key nodes, and then a diffusion of the investment more broadly around the UK and leveraging a lot of the existing logistics networks, which is associated with some of the key trunk roads in the UK. So just step back from that kind of image of what the future maybe in 15 odd years looks like, and focus on the drivers for how we actually enable that in the last few minutes. So shipping's actually primarily regulated by the International Maritime Organization, and a lot of the domestic regulation flows out of what the IMO is doing. And last year, the IMO agreed to a very aggressive new set of international targets, and it's in the process of finalizing the details of the policy mechanisms that will then drive that change. So from that, we know that international shipping, ferries that sail across the channel, a lot of the ships that bring goods into the UK for further onwards distribution, will need to reduce their average emissions by about 90% by 2040. And that's why I'm using a 15-year timescale, because that 90% means essentially no fossil use in international ships in that timescale. And so, or very, very small amounts, but the main energy transition that we're envisaging needs to have unfolded by then. That's a very significant, rapid shift that then needs to unfold, but it also creates opportunities for some of the other intermodal connections, investments. So there's a lot of port investment that needs to happen in that period of time that could be beneficial to road freight's decarbonisation. Ports will significantly electrify because ships will need to be connected to shore electricity rather than using their onboard generators whilst they're ashore. So all of this creates that electricity grid investment driver, that policy that we already have from the IMO. We then have the UK policy, which has been quite unclear for maritime, at least. We have the Clean Maritime Plan that was adopted in 2019, but no clear policy that has flown out of that. And road freight, as I'm sure you're aware, has had various concepts that have looked similar to some of the private vehicle. So future bans on technology, which can work in a sector that has a reasonably high turnover of vehicles, depending on how ambitious you want to be. So the main thing that we are lacking is the clarity in the UK domestic policy that could drive particularly the investments in domestic shipping that aren't going to be driven by the IMO policy, which tends to only act on international ships, even if it does drive some infrastructure, but also some of the nearer scale infrastructure needs and the rollout of a UK-centric solution. And my final comment there is that I think that when we look at freight, and maybe this is one of the differences with some of the other speakers that we can explore in a discussion. When we look at freight, the obvious solution, at least to us, is for a very top-down, nationally determined plan, at least for the infrastructure and the technology and the work to do with demand, because otherwise you wouldn't have the interoperability. We wouldn't have trucks that were able to, if one part of the UK wanted to do hydrogen trucks and the other part wanted to do overhead electric rail systems, we would be in trouble. We need a certain amount of centralization. We need the ports to use common interfaces so ships can call in, not just in the UK, but also overseas. So there's an element of this which is top down, and that isn't going to be the same as what you necessarily need to maximize the appropriateness of solutions for the regions or for the cities where you might want a lot more control. So how do we have a system which is going to be efficient from that overall deployment of a massive amount of electrification for freight, that we can also continue to have more devolved, more local solutions plugging into metaphorically as well as literally as we go through that. And I think that puzzle we haven't found the solution to, but maybe this conversation can explore a little bit as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tristan. That was really interesting. So you've talked to us about liquid fuels for ships, electrification for trucks and rail. I think you've done a great job of actually showing us how everything links together. And I agree, your final point is incredibly interesting. I was really hoping you'd have a solution for us about the need for a centralized top-down approach that is also meeting the devolution requirements, but perhaps that is something we'll discuss later. So our final speaker today, before we move to panel questions, is Neil Birch.
Thank you very much. Last and hopefully by no means least. So yeah, I'm going to start to try and open the debate up a little bit about how do we start to make some of those necessary impacts that David, Jorgen, and Tristan have been flagging to us. So if we look at the next slide, what are the sort of major ways in which we could approach tackling the problem from a public transport perspective? Well, certainly investing in public transport is a key strategy for decarbonisation. We all probably recognise on this webinar that it can significantly reduce the number of individual vehicles on the road, and that in itself will naturally result in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, modern energy efficient public transport using electricity or hydrogen will have a much lower carbon footprint than the equivalent number of private cars, no matter how green those cars might be. Public transport vehicles, especially when using renewable power sources, and of course we need to challenge ourselves around in that electricity debate. The bus company, which is based not very far away from where I live, has a fleet of electric vehicles. It charges them up using a diesel generator overnight because the grid can't supply the amount of electricity it needs. That isn't very renewable and green at the end of the day. But investment in the right sort of public transport can certainly facilitate transition to cleaner technologies, use less energy to carry the same number of passengers, and therefore contribute to overall energy savings and decarbonisation. Encouraging modal shift from private car to public transport can be achieved through investing in reliable, frequent and affordable public transport services. I've seen already in the chat and the questions people alluding to that. Yes, that's the that's the carrot side of the carrot and stick equation, isn't it? And we need to aim to reduce the need for long distance travel and promote more sustainable urban growth patterns. One of the things that I think is often overlooked is that investment in public transport can spur wider innovations in low carbon technology. So the need for better and more reliable and longer range battery electric vehicles, the need to tackle the challenge of particularly long journeys on the longer distance coach network, which might require the development of more efficient hydrogen fuel cells, just a couple of examples of where we might need to go. And we also need to look at smart infrastructure such as real-time data systems for optimizing routes, reducing idling, and thereby reducing the overall emissions. And finally, beyond the environmental impacts, investing in public transport can have significant economic and social benefits. It can help to create jobs, both directly in the public transport sector, but also indirectly through economic stimulation and through indeed investing in the decarbonisation industry sector. But it can also help to tackle social inclusion, improve mobility options for everybody, and therefore help to overcome some of the challenges that David was flagging around equitable decarbonisation efforts. So on the next slide, just very briefly, I'll touch on 3 examples of success and 3 examples of some challenges and failures, perhaps. So Copenhagen has invested very heavily in a whole range of green transport initiatives. It's probably perhaps best known for its investment in cycling infrastructure, but actually that is complemented by an extremely comprehensive and high quality public transport network. So a lot of this is about carefully targeting the right mode for the right type of travel, and it's this combination is contributing to the target for Copenhagen to be carbon neutral by 2025. Curitiba, perhaps at a different scale, Curitiba well known for its bus rapid transit system, which has served as a model for many cities worldwide. BRT system, much cheaper to deliver than a rail-based system, much more flexible, and therefore a lot more bang for your bucks, if you like. And that has, in a city which was very much focused on use and reliance on individual cars, that has really helped to lower overall greenhouse gas emissions, reducing traffic congestion, improving air quality, and integrating the bus rapid transit system into a more sustainable urban planning system. And then finally, back in Scandinavia, Oslo has again implemented a range of measures to tackle carbon emissions from transport. The promotion of electric vehicles is a very significant part of the Norwegian government's agenda, and as part of that, an investment in public transport. Public transport in Oslo, buses, trams, ferries, metro system, all increasingly powered from renewable energy sources, and I think that is another key component to how we help to decarbonise transport. But some locations have faced much greater challenges. So Los Angeles, west coast of America, the part of America, if you like, that is championing the greener agenda, despite very significant investment in expanding its metro and bus systems, it struggled to reduce car dependency. A lot of that is to do with urban sprawl, low density development, and a very entrenched car culture, and that has resulted in continued high greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. In a similar vein, Sydney, but the Australian government at both federal and state levels has not been an early adopter of green technology, and Sydney has faced particular challenges in reducing its carbon footprint, again, despite some quite groundbreaking investments in public transport. It's relied very much on rolling out more diesel buses rather than electric or other forms of powered buses. And it's also not got a particularly well integrated public transport planning system. So each of the modes tends to be planned in isolation. And then finally, back here in the UK, Leeds has had its on-off relationship with a rapid transit network. We were originally expecting to have a tram in Leeds, probably the best part of 15 years ago, cancelled after significant cost overruns and delays, relied on buses, but again, those buses that it's been relying on predominantly diesel powered, and therefore it's not been able to achieve those decarbonisation targets. So delivering successful public transport investment to achieve decarbonisation, very, very multifaceted and influenced by a whole wide range of different factors. So on the next slide, just very briefly, what are the lessons that we can learn from those examples? First of all, inadequate modal shift. In some locations, investment in public transport did not result in a significant shift from car to public transport. This will occur if the systems are not convenient, they're not reliable, or they're not fast enough to compete with the convenience of personal vehicles. And if you don't achieve a step change in the number of people using public transport and changing their travel habits, then the potential for decarbonisation is really reduced. Secondly, a continued reliance on high emission vehicles. Yes, that switch from private car to public transport is a good switch to make. But if the public transport remains predominantly powered by high emission vehicles, then we're only going a very small step of the way in terms of making our public transport energy efficient and helping to deliver the decarbonisation that we're aiming for. And then finally, that lack of integration and planning. We heard about that I've just mentioned that in Los Angeles and in Sydney, for example. Successful decarbonisation through public transport requires a holistic approach that includes urban planning as well as planning of the transport network itself. We need integration between all the modes, and we do need incentives for use, which brings us back to something that a couple of the speakers have already alluded to in terms of carrots and sticks. New transit lines and new services that are not properly connected to each other and to the existing network just make it more difficult to use public transport. So we do need everything planned in a holistic way. So on the next slide, we'll look at how do we go about applying those lessons. We've all, I think, probably today spoken about sticks and carrots, whether we've used that expression or not. We do need a combination of the two, and of course, it's a lot more palatable for politicians to offer carrots. They don't really want to wield the big stick. Integrating with development planning, I think, is absolutely fundamental. We're starting to see that perhaps in some other forms of urban planning through some of the local neighbourhood schemes, but we do need to start really getting the UK to focus on transit-oriented development. If we don't get the density of development that can support a decent public transport network, then it will be far too expensive to deliver that network, and we simply won't achieve the goals that we're looking for. And in Sally's area of expertise, behaviour change. How do we understand the right answers to the right questions in the right places? One size won't fit all, and we need to understand just exactly what carrots and sticks will work in any particular location. A couple of examples just to largely finish with. We've started to throw some money at the bus sector in the UK. This is entirely through a series of competitions run by either DFT or Transport Scotland in Scotland, through the Zebra and ScotZeb schemes. I really do feel that we've got a missed opportunity here to turbocharge the zero emission bus sector in the UK. 50 years ago, the bus sector faced some existential problems. It was just simply far too expensive to continue to deliver the bus network compared to the numbers of people that were travelling. And to help the industry transition to something more sustainable, the government introduced what was called New Bus Grant. And in its final form, that paid for 50% of the cost of a bus that was suitable for one-person operation. So it allowed the buses to be modernised, become more efficient, therefore become cheaper to operate, and it allowed the elimination of the bus conductor. All of that helped to sustain the bus network for much longer than would otherwise have been the case. Why don't we look to champion that in the UK, and at the same time use that to turbocharge our own zero emission bus sector? That would clearly increase the amount of demand, and it might well help the UK sector to position as a world leader. On trains, we're starting to look at battery multiple units. That's been a long time coming. We've been talking about it for years and years and years. We only have to look across the Ash Sea to the Republic of Ireland, where in Wicklow they might actually be getting something off the ground sooner rather than later. We really need to move much more quickly in terms of the technologies. But then just finally on the last slide, there are some challenges to overcome. There are huge challenges around, for example, switching to battery electric vehicles, battery electric buses, huge demand on the grid. I gave you that anecdote about the bus company down the road from here who can't get sufficient power to recharge its battery electric buses. We need to understand a lot more about how to manage energy consumption, both in terms of the peaks and troughs during the day, about the geography of where those power spikes are delivered, to deliver hydrogen. Again, I think I saw in the Q&A or the chat about the challenges of delivering enough renewable energy to create green hydrogen. So yeah, big challenges around there. So there's the need for a whole range of mobility design tools to help to redesign the public transport network of the future, so that it's fit for purpose and it can meet those challenges. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Sally at that point.
That was great. Thank you very much, Neil. So some more comments about the need for integration in planning and deciding things together. So thank you everyone who's been putting in comments and questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder that if you'd like me to review a question to ask, then it needs to go into the Q&A. Juliana has been putting in some links throughout the discussions. So if you want to find out some more about some of these really interesting pieces of research that our panelists have been talking about, there are some links there for you to use. But we're now going to move on to the question and answer session. I would like to just start with a couple of technical clarifications because we had a couple of questions. So Jürgen, would you mind just explaining electric road systems and platooning just in a little bit more detail so people know what they are?
Yes, absolutely. I saw that come in and I felt I'd failed.
Oh, no, not at all.
Electric road systems are essentially a similar technology is used on the train network. You can have one of two, well, there's actually one of three different approaches actually. The first one being a pantograph type technology, where you pick up an overhead line through a pantograph, and that provides the power you need to support the vehicle. Another way is what's called a hot rail, which is either a rail by the side of a particular road, which you hook up onto, the same as you can see on some of the Eastern Line trains. And the third way is essentially inducted loop technology, which is actually embedded in the road surface itself, which essentially provides the electromagnetic field, which is then converted to power. So those are the three different technologies. Out of those technologies, probably the least mature is the inductive loop, although inductive loop trials have been undertaken. I think it's in Italy, and have demonstrated actually they work and work very well. Yeah, those are the three. And then platooning is essentially one of the autonomous mobility type activities where you have one vehicle which is essentially manually driven, then followed by autonomous vehicles which essentially daisy chained behind that particular vehicle, and they essentially follow the leader. It's probably the simplest, one of the simplest forms of autonomous mobility. They have been trialled in the UK. They've also been trialled to good extent in a number of different areas, including, I think there was one from something like Cologne to Düsseldorf or somewhere in Germany, to demonstrate that it could actually follow the leader for a significant period of time in a real world and a real road condition environment. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I think some of the questions that have been coming out kind of relate to a just transition and things being fairer. We've had a few questions about cost per mile is going to hit people in rural areas more hard. I was just wondering if we could kind of have a little think about that. So I don't know if Neil or David, you'd like to have a first stab at answering some of the questions that have been raised about, you know, if we introduce things like road user charging, if we introduce things like cost per mileage, how can we do that in a fair and equitable way?
If I go first, I think the fairest scheme is the scheme that charges the people who do the most miles more than the people who do least miles. So therefore, the fuel just increasing, or putting a carbon tax on fuel, and ultimately the distance-based charging is the fairest, because effectively you are charging the people who are using the road or the carbon emission more than the people who aren't using it, and it's therefore fairer than car tax or whatever, where you're effectively taxing everyone whether they use fuel or not effectively. So as a way of replacing fuel duty, I think road user charging, and in the meantime use the fuel price as an equitable way, and make sure then that you are the people who can't afford that increase are subsidising in other forms of tax or whatever as necessary. I don't think the rural issue is that big, because I think ultimately they will be the easiest people to get into electric vehicles, because despite what you think, they are not typically driving hundreds of miles more than the range of a battery. There's a very high availability of off-road parking at home, and therefore keeping your vehicle charged is easy. And it is, as the second-hand market is established, I think EVs will solve the rural problem without worrying too much about them having to do anything fancier in terms of using buses that don't exist, or walking for 10, 15 miles to get to the nearest shop or whatever it might be. So they will remain in cars, but those cars will become electric or zero emission a lot quicker and a lot easier than in rural areas with no off-street parking. So I don't think the rural issue is as big a problem as people make out. And the main point about equity is it's being used as an excuse for not doing something. It's not that big a problem. It's effectively being used as an excuse for not doing the obvious, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Did you have anything to add to that, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, delivering better public transport in rural areas will be extremely expensive, and I think that I don't think adopting a very simple mindset of private car bad, public transport good is really going to be helpful. So I'd basically echo a lot of what David was saying there, that probably the best form of rural transport is going to be heavily reliant on the private car. We just need to make the private car as decarbonised as possible, as least polluting as we possibly can do. I think the interesting thing about the social equity question is that in areas where we can afford to make an investment in really improving the public transport system, as I think I mentioned as a bit of a throwaway comment in my presentation, it's got a lot of other benefits. It's not just about again mode share switching, and that's good from a decarbonisation point, although it is. But actually, if you've got a better public transport system for deprived parts of urban areas, then that opens up, you know, much better mobility, opens up much better accessibility to jobs, services, all the things that we know we need to deliver. So actually, you get a bounce from that social equity point of view. But it is true, and I'm sure we're going to come on to it in the debate, and because I've seen it already in the chat, delivering that is going to cost money. So, you know, in my head, the thing that we need to start to try to get politicians' minds around is the need for some of those sticks which are finance related, and then recirculating that money into enhancing public transport in particular, from my perspective, but reallocating that into better transport, more, you know, greener transport. And one of the remaining challenges which London has started to look at is making sure that we improve public transport before we start to wield the big stick, because you can't, if you try and do it the other way around, you either get such a political backlash it doesn't happen, or you get, you know, the behavioural change becomes impossible. So there's a need for some sort of investment fund, which maybe then gets paid back ultimately. Maybe it's not necessarily a subsidy as such; it's a loan, but the loan is paid back in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, when we've actually started to deliver those differences.
Yeah, thank you, Nell. I think you've answered some questions people have in public transport.
Sorry, Sally, can I just
ahead.
come in on that for 1 second? From a road user charging point of view, I would like to suggest that we also look to what others have already done. So if you look at New Zealand, which I think is probably the best example, they've actually tackled it, road user charging based on odometer readings, but also based around where you live. So if you live in a very rural community, which I do, I can't get anywhere by public transport without using the car, at least for first mile, last mile. It takes that into account. And actually, it's a very, very simple system, which I think we should at least look at, not necessarily adopt, because I think we can improve it. But by the same token, it's a system already in operation, which has proven to work. So on that note, I'll be quiet again.
That was useful. Thank you, Jürgen. I think slightly related to this, and still thinking about the road user charging, we did have a question about, okay, well, maybe that will dissuade long journeys, but actually it's the shorter journeys and the frequent shorter journeys that, you know, cause a lot of the pollution. And I think a related question as well is that many organisations characterise decarbonisation under avoid, shift and improve. Virtually all initiatives focus on shift and improve. What can we take to contribute to avoid the need to travel? So I think, could we maybe start with Neil on this question?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so hands up. I'm at heart a bus network planner. I tend to forget about avoid, and I focus very much on the other elements. And I guess we do need to challenge ourselves about how we reduce the need to travel. We might all think that it's, you know, basically working from home and having lots of wonderful links to join a webinar like this. And David nicely demonstrated that actually that isn't necessarily quite as seamless and easy as we might want it to be. So thank you for that, David. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is about how do we make that public transport as effective as it possibly can be, and putting that in the right places. So actually, I think a focus on reducing the number of trips rather than the number of kilometres might actually be quite useful, because the place where public transport can make a difference is often on those shorter distance trips. It's much more challenging to start to tackle some of those longer journeys, which are often quite diverse in terms of their origins and destinations, and require, you know, the public transport solution might require lots and lots of interchange, and that just becomes, I'm not saying that is impossible, but it just becomes a much less attractive alternative. Whereas in a more urbanized environment where people are making relatively short trips from where they live into a town centre, with a bit of luck, that is walking to a conveniently located bus stop and getting on a bus that runs quite frequently and reliably, and getting off the bus somewhere suitable in a town centre that, again, is a short walk from the final destination.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. I'd quite like to ask this to Jürgen as well, because that was the RUC was one of the areas where I felt you were a bit more, yes, do this action. A lot of them felt like things that we should be trialing for the future, but you seem to be quite confident about RUC, as did you, David. So, Jürgen, what do you think about this? Does it dissuade short trips that actually can do a lot of harm?
I think it can do. It depends on what RUC type approach you take, and whether it's in the city or whether it's more intercity type approaches. I think there are ways of doing both. I don't necessarily think they need to be the same. There is some suggestion that, okay, if you do it one place, you have to do it, you have to have the same system throughout. But I think London's proven that's not necessarily the case. Oh, Singapore, well, no, Singapore is actually different because it's, but anyway, but London has proven that's not necessarily the case. I think it's possible to do road user charging in ways which are not particularly technology intensive as well. And there is an article again in Transport Extra related specifically to that. So, and the reason that's important is because if you start implementing the technology and the back office systems associated with that, what you get is a very costly solution, which isn't necessarily viable in the longer term, particularly when, if you get to a situation where you're having a reduction in traffic by 15% or so, at that point, it's no longer viable. So you have to start looking at road user charging, particularly in a more urban setting, which is able to be achieved without that technology input. So it is achievable, in my opinion. And as we know that, I think some of the stats I've been seeing just recently were majority of the trips were less than 3 miles per day. And you just think, I can walk 3 miles. Well, I perhaps can't, but I should be able to. But the point being is that you can start doing that avoidance if you start looking at other technologies. But as Neil said, there has to be an implementation of public transport or alternative transport in advance. Otherwise, there's just going to be such a backlash that nobody's going to have the political will to succeed on that front.
Thank you.
I'll pass over to David.
Yeah, and then I'd also like Tristan's view after David.
Oh, sorry,
on
Tristan.
Freight. But no, we'll start with David. Let's hear David's views.
Yeah, so I think I have 4 points to make. One is that most of the emissions actually come from long trips. So everybody thinks of the short trip and therefore that's all the emissions. But actually, if you look at the split, most of the CO2 emissions come from long trips. The easiest form of road user charging for short trips is parking, because effectively that you're targeting the trip, no matter how short it is, effectively, and you're not trying to compete with a distance-based or a very unfair distance-based charge, but you've got the ability to charge for parking, so every journey that stops at the end of its short trip should be charged where possible. Workplace levies obviously come into that. The easiest way of doing avoid is the travel to work. So mandate companies to allow working from home and not having to commute or wherever. And trying not to bounce back from everybody going back to the office or wherever where possible, basically. And the other form of avoid is to use one car instead of two, so that you're still both doing, or the 2 or 3 of you that are making the trip are still doing whatever it was you needed to do, but you're using one car. So it's a form of avoid, or it's if you like, it's a mode shift to a passenger rather than a driver. But it's very politically hard to tell people that they can't travel for as much as they're doing at the minute. So that, from a political acceptability, I wouldn't overemphasize the avoid, but it is you park short trips by parking. Don't travel to work unless you have to, or have an ability to work from home or whatever. Car share and make the cost of individual car use for long journeys such that car sharing becomes more attractive and the nuisance factor of it becomes more attractive. And don't overemphasize the message that we're going to stop you going anywhere, going on your holidays, heading to the Scottish Hills, whatever it is that you do, that you're going to vote for the other party if you hear people trying to change your life.
Thanks very much, David. So Tristan, can I just ask you about the road user charging and how that could affect freight?
Yeah, can I check? Because I don't come across the conversation on road user charging and freight decarbonisation very much. Might be my shortcoming. But do you mean as in differentiated road user charges depending on your emissions, or do you just mean a flat rate for using flat rate per mile? What's the concept that
sorry, David, were you going to?
I would guess the former, yeah. It's
differentiated.
Ultra low emission zones and carbon tax and
Okay.
charged by vehicle type, fuel type.
So then we're basically talking about carbon tax. It's a euphemism for carbon tax. So as a mechanism that has a role as part of a policy combination for freight. But if you only use a carbon price, then unfortunately you don't necessarily drive the most cost-effective transition. And part of the reason for that is that there is significant market barriers and failures that exist within the freight markets, within the value chain that provides freight services. And so we have some very vertically integrated operators who have ownership of the assets and manage the driver teams and plan the operations, but we have lots of other structures within the freight industry where those are very separated. And particularly where it's separated, then a carbon tax applied to one of those parties often doesn't flow through and incentivize the right behaviors on the other. The other problem that you have is, so generally speaking, we tend to see solutions that are driven through a mandate, through a command and control policy that says you must have lower greenhouse gas intensity of X at this point in time, or we ban this technology at this point in time, or we ban this fuel at this point in time. Those technologies create much clearer signaling and actually enable investment more efficiently in a sector like a freight market. Now, I recognize that might be very different from public and private transport, so this might be a kind of a key difference, but that tends to be the preferred solution. For the carbon tax or the road user charging, if there's an element of that, is actually quite useful, particularly for the subject of equity that you were just talking about, and that's just as important for freight and for shipping as it is for this urban-rural conversation that's going on around private and public transport. If you imagine that some of the Scottish Islands, for which the shipping is a key enabler of their availability of social and economic services, education, healthcare, if you suddenly whack up the price of that ferry journey by a magnitude in order to achieve decarbonisation, that's going to have an impact on those communities, which needs to be factored in, which you can't do if your only tool to decarbonise the freight modes and shipping is a mandate, unless you're subsidising out of general taxation. And I think one of the challenges that the UK government has as it goes through this, and something they've been pathetically weak on so far, is to acknowledge the hypothecation question. So if we were to do road user charging, most of my presumption is the Treasury would absorb that money for general purposes and have an opaque system where it would put it wherever politically was convenient for the government of the day. But actually, if you step back from that and say we're taxing road use for private, public, for freight, but we are going to invest at least a decent lump of that revenue into the equity issue and into the infrastructure issue, then you would have a much more transparent and I think more bought into set of decisions that would be helpful for transport decarbonisation and help solve why it's being forgotten about as it is at the moment by Treasury and by government generally.
Thank you, Tristan. I think this does bring us back to points that came out, I'd say, across all of the presentations, that and relating to questions, we've got some questions talking about, we've got a history of land use planning and decisions that we now need to respond to. We've got highways agencies national highways who are used to, like, transport officers using the highway, the SRN, in a certain way. How does that now link into the new ways of behaviour? And the fact that we need kind of a centralised view. So we have historical infrastructure, historical policies and planning, but we really need that integrated view. And it was really interesting, Tristan, that you brought in ships. I hadn't been kind of thinking about ships, but actually it's a really important piece of a broader picture. So I think there's a question to all of you in turn. How can we practically achieve change? I need you to give me a little bit of hope and optimism, because just listening to all of you, my fear is that it's going to be so hard to get that overall view of what needs to happen, that how are we going to achieve it? And Jürgen, I loved hearing about the new technologies, but it's like, okay, well, we need lots of testing. We're going down a road of EVs and we don't even know if it's the right road. So yeah, how are we going to get that overall view? How can we actually solve this problem? So David, you've come off mic. So would you like to kind of give some thoughts first?
I think it needs that to stop being a political issue, so that parties are effectively not accepting the argument that we need to do something. And I think if you had a consensus and everybody agreed you had to do something, and the question became, what do we need to do, rather than governments changing their mind and flip-flopping between for the motors and not for the motors, and sort of making it into a political argument, and the whole thing getting spun by then the populist press into a political issue. So I think if we just could agree, effectively following the guidance and the advice from the Committee on Climate Change, this is what needs to happen, how are we going to make it happen, and then getting that message out that this is going to happen and it is going to be more expensive to drive fossil fuel vehicles, and we are going to decarbonise, so that it stops being a political football, basically, or a political excuse for not doing anything because you're scared of being on the wrong side of the obvious debate.
And is that realistic?
No. Did you want a realistic answer?
If we want to live in reality for a moment, what could we do to actually inspire change?
Make it cost effective to behave well, basically. So subsidize the use of the sustainable modes ultimately, and pay for that by the use of the unsustainable modes. Make it in your interest to do the right thing, and not for everybody else to do the right thing whilst you continue to drive about in your diesel or your car or whatever it is, instead of using alternatives, whilst everybody else, in your opinion, should be changing their behaviour. So if it's in your interest, both the health benefits of active travel, the cost implications of not having to pay for the ongoing rising price of fossil fuel, and the fact that you can use a lovely bus because you've now got your bus is subsidised, or actually comes to your town or your village, whatever it is. So just generally make it easy to accept the change, and not make it something that you have to fight.
Okay.
People were shaking their fist at you at public meetings.
Yeah, I do hear this. I hear the kind of, okay, we need behaviour change, and we need to make that behaviour change appealing. We need to facilitate it. So we can't give a stick without actually facilitating the change that we need to have. So all of that's really useful. Neil, should we move on to you? How can we actually practically achieve the changes that we need to achieve?
I'm swither between being a glass half empty and a glass half full sort of a guy on this. So I think it's really, I think a lot of it is actually really easy. So I'd follow on for what David was saying, and I'd say that we need to invest in public transport. I would say that, wouldn't I, because I'm a public transport planner, but we need to do that up front. And, we need to be demonstrating for a consistent period of time that public transport is a genuine alternative for a significant number of people, not for everybody, but for a significant number of people. And that requires spending money on the right forms of public transport. And that might involve difficult decisions, not only about the size of the public transport budget, but about the modes within public transport that money is focused on. We spend an eye-wateringly large amount of money on trains, and we spend a disproportionately small amount of money on buses, for example. Is that the right balance? I think a lot of people would see improved benefits from public transport if we improve the bus network, and relatively speaking, that is a much cheaper thing to do than improving the rail network. I think that we will see, again, my personal view here, not SYSTRA's, but I think we will see that is the trajectory that Greater Manchester will end up following, that it has taken control of its public transport network. I think it will find that it needs to spend more money on delivering that, but I think that it will perhaps also start to find that there's a local political will to be prepared to do that, but that will only be happening because it has started to make those improvements. And I would echo what Tristan said earlier on about hypothecation. I think, if we do go down the route of charging people more to travel by private car, we need to be demonstrating that we're recycling that into better forms of public transport for everybody.
Great, thank you, Neil. Jürgen, I'm going to slightly change the question for you, actually. It was so interesting hearing about different technologies. It was so interesting hearing kind of your views on electric vehicles. So how do you feel we can create the change with technologies when we're not fully confident, if I'm interpreting rightly, that what we're doing right now is the right thing? So the big push on electric vehicles that I think does have cut through to the public. How can we achieve change now while also identifying the best changes?
Well, as I said, I think one of the areas that I could really be an advocate of, and I think our government needs to be an advocate of, is trialling new technologies so that we can identify what does work for the UK and what doesn't. So we have better data, better access to data, better access to systems. I think that's got to be the first step, because if we don't start doing that, then we're never going to know. And at the moment, to be blunt, the UK is lagging behind some of the rest of the world, simply because we're not doing those kind of trials. You know, as an example, autonomous vehicles have been on the road in California for years now, actually. Yes, there are still issues with them, but until we actually start doing those trials, we're not going to understand what those issues are. So I think we can do that. But I do want to come back to that first question anyway, because I really agree with what everybody else has said. But the problem with government at the moment is that they seem to be fixated on what's best for the party rather than what's best for the country. Because it's a short-term plan. It's always a 4-year plan at best. Sometimes 46-day plan. But anyway, that's beside the point. But the point is, we have to start looking at what's better for the country rather than what's better for the party. And the only way we can do that, in my opinion, is if we have cross-party agreements on some of this stuff. If we don't get those cross-party agreements, this will never happen. So if we can't get the cross-party agreements within government, I think we have to do it outside of government and then feed that information to them as almost a fait accompli. And the only way we can do that is coming together as a group of individuals and potentially experts who really understand the issue and really understand the opportunities for that. And I seriously think we should start that process anyway, because unless we do that, they're not going to start. So at that point, I'm going to hand back over to you, Sally. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And Tristan, just finally coming back to you on how can we get that link up? So you talked about the importance of kind of centralized. Can you see any methods of doing that? And what would be the biggest kind of changes that we would be asking for?
Yeah, I can. So I didn't give you an answer earlier, but maybe I can now. In the backdrop, you have to have clarity and credibility of imminent regulation. And at least in freight, we haven't had that. In ships, we haven't had that. There's kind of ban in 2030 of the sale of new automotive and internal combustion cars had an effect to that. But you had to have something like that, which is showing that there is a very finite period for an existing technology. That then enables groups of different actors to come together. And I think that what we've seen in the freight sector is there've been a series of investments by government into somewhere between academia and industry and local communities. And there's something called the Clean Maritime Research Hub, which is a new project which is starting off, and then a transit project, where actually the combination of models exploring some of the techno-economics of this transition in combination with stakeholder input, querying the models and saying what doesn't work, in combination with political or policy perspectives being put into the conversation. And those projects, which run 3 or 4 years, can create some very helpful discussions. But I think the other thing that we need is to stop pretending that we have time to be technology agnostic and to start to actually pick winners. And this is where I think I disagree a little bit with Jorgen's suggestion that what we need is a load more trials. We've actually done a load of trials. We've had some experience. There's also a massive pool of knowledge from outside of the UK because the UK is lagging. So we can look at any of these basic questions and pull the data from overseas and make quick decisions now, because in 2024, we really have no other option, because the rollout, if we have another 5 years of trials and stroking our beards about this, is not going to be the investment speed that we need. So that needs to happen at the speed of the next 1 or 2 years, and hopefully we'll have a new administration that will have more courage in order
Thank
to
you,
do that.
Tristan. Well, we're out of time. That's been so interesting. I've learnt a lot. I've learnt new technologies. Thank you all for kind of expressing your views on things as well, and all the different options available to us. And let's go back to the urgency. This does need to happen. Things do need to change, and I think we're all responsible for that. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the webinar. As I said, there's links in the chats to go through and read a lot more and all of this interesting work. Thank you very much, all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.